Hello, welcome
Hey,
back to All Along the Watchtower, hopefully the best Watchmen podcast retrospective on the internet. I am your host, Baylor Thornton. We have a great show lined up for you today with a very special guest, my dad.
uh, okay, we'll go with that.
Well, what would you rather have me say?
Well, I'm only 10 years older than you, so we'll
Okay,
go with that.
my big brother. How about that?
Okay, so Baylor, I want to know why, like, I never read the graphic novel. You know that.
Yeah.
How is the movie different?
Okay, so a little preface. The year is 2009. Off the success of other darker comic book films such as Sin City, 300, Hellboy, and especially The Dark Knight, Warner, Bro-
Yeah,
Warner Brothers finally deems it fit to adapt this book they've been trying to adapt for decades. Terry Gilliam at one point was to direct a version until he deemed it unfilmable. And and it's important to note that for any adaptation of Alan Moore's work, regardless of quality, his name is never on it. If he had his way,
yeah.
if he had his name, it wouldn't happen.
So why does this graphic novel and the movie transcend? Like, you could put any country, it's like Cold War ish, right?
That's when the book was written, the 80s. So, and it's very much
Yeah.
a reflection of that.
But it could be China, it could be the Middle East, it could be anything,
You're saying it,
right?
you're saying it could easily be modernized.
Yeah, it could be. It transcends.
Well, that's what the show did, and we'll get to that in a little bit.
Well, I haven't watched the show, but
I'll get to that towards the end. But
yeah. I want to know why, besides the weird guy with the who's blue with the big weird like penis,
yeah, Doctor Manhattan.
none of them had superpowers.
No, that was the idea of this comic book, to take Silver Age comic book characters into the real world and expose the fallacies in those old comic books and their worldviews.
Like Silk Spectra could kick ass. We know that. And what Patrick Wilson,
Yeah.
Owlman or whatever,
Oh, yeah.
they could kick ass. Oh, can I say that on
Yeah.
TV or
Okay.
but they weren't supers.
Well, no.
Elastigirl was Elastigirl. You know we love that movie.
Yeah. So
So,
your first question is, why don't they have powers?
yeah.
Well, that's the thing. In this movie, they kind of do. Like in the comic, well, I'll just say one of my main critiques of this movie is that all of the violence is enhanced for this movie. In
Yeah.
the book, any like little like violence was very brief and very striking, while in the movie, anything in the book that was just a little bit has been expanded into this giant fight scene.
Yeah. Okay, I get it.
So I would say this in this movie they have more powers than they do in the book, which kind of takes away from the point they're making about the idea of a superhero and agency and like the fundamental deconstruction of that. Okay,
Okay.
so let's speak more generally. Because I invited you on this stream because when this movie came out, I was not the main demographic. Well, one, because I was in fourth grade, and two, because I'm a comics fan. You're more the main demographic because Warner Brothers and Paramount was hoping to create a blockbuster out of this to like have it cross over to the mainstream and make $1 billion.
Yeah.
That that didn't
And
happen.
no, it did not, but it should have, I think.
Really? So as
I
a
think
cat,
it has longevity.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, I watched it 2 days ago. I rewatched it. I think it works.
You like it?
Yeah, I do. I mean, not like Wonder Woman, but that's different. You know
Uh,
me.
As a casual fan, you like the movie?
I do. I really do. I think
Okay.
it's great. And I think if maybe, uh, Warner, it was darker.
Well, yeah, the comic was always darker than
Yeah.
typical
So
stuff.
I think that limited the amount of people that could see it.
Well, yeah, it was a very different landscape from now when Joker and Deadpool can make $1 billion.
Yeah, it's different. Yeah, I
Yeah,
agree.
2009 was a very different time for comic book history.
And we know Deadpool rocks out.
Yeah,
It,
but in
um,
2009, Deadpool was just this guy with a mouth his mouth sewn. Nobody
yeah,
when he was
yeah, that wouldn't work.
when it was in a movie, they had to change it.
Yeah, that would not work. So anyway, um, but I I actually watched it twice.
You did?
Yeah, I did. You see more things the more you watch it.
Yeah, one positive I have for this is that the world building, like the comic book, is very rich. There's a lot of stuff happening in every scene.
Yeah,
New York City looks great. They really did spare no expense in making it feel like this alternate reality, which it should feel like that.
yeah. No, I agree. Why was there a hustler on the coffee table?
To establish this was the 80s.
Oh, yeah. That's a good mag, but um we won't go into that. It's like violent, but not really violent. I mean,
I would
it,
say the violence is too extreme in this
it's
movie.
not like Kick Ass,
Well, no. Like, I
which
feel
I
like,
loved,
yeah, of course, Kick Ass is fun.
but
One of my main things about this movie is that the violence is often was just ridiculous. Like it would they enhanced the violence and then they didn't have, which is okay, but they didn't have a narrative purpose behind it. The
yeah,
assassin
yeah,
the assassination scene I think is the worst example because it's just overloaded gore and slow motion effects and without really saying anything like why are you showing me this?
yeah. No, I agree. Um, anyway, but I am very thankful that you asked me to contribute. What do you want to ask me?
Another question I have is because this was the first of 4 movies Zack Snyder made for DC. How has that influenced your view of this? Because this was the movie that gave him those jobs.
Yeah.
He did
Okay.
this first.
Well, I really wish they would have released the Zack Snyder cut. And I know that there was a lot of stuff going on with his daughter, and, you
Yeah.
know, I think it would have been better.
Well, we're going to see it
Well, yeah, but when?
next year.
In the theater or?
HBO Max exclusive.
Well, we have that. You
Yeah.
have my login, so that's fine.
I should ask that. What was your opinion of this movie when it came out? Because you like it now, but times have changed. You've come to accept certain things in comic book films. So
Yeah,
when it
no,
came out, what was different?
it's darker than, but you know what? Deadpool kind of, I think, broke the ground. I know that's a different universe or
That's a
whatever,
huge hit of these type of movies.
but like comic book movies were Catwoman and the old Batman with Michael Keaton and funny.
Yeah,
And then Deadpool came out and he was a hard ass.
yeah,
So it's different.
yeah. It
So
is.
when you go back and relook at it, um, it's a different perspective.
Yeah,
Do you
but
agree?
I remember you were weirded out by this movie when you first saw it.
Yeah, I was, because I had never been exposed to
Yeah,
that. But
I mean, this movie happened because it did expose millions to people to what a comic book movie can be, because this was very different from the stuff on the marketplace when it came out.
yeah, there's no like tights and capes and, well, I think actually there were a cape,
Yeah, there were
but
capes.
um yeah, it was different. Um but when you rewatch it, it's good.
Yeah. What'd you think of that article I sent you about making the argument that The Incredibles was a better adaptation than this movie?
Well, I love The Incredibles.
Well, yeah, of course that's the better movie, but
I've got
what?
the costumes, I
Yeah,
think, somewhere.
you think it holds up as a casual superhero film?
Uh, ye- yeah, I do. I
Okay,
mean, they don't have powers, but besides a big blue penis, no, I think it does hold up.
okay, interesting.
Do you
All right.
not?
Well, keep in mind, I'm doing this from a very different perspective from yours. I can, having read the book, I can see certain flaws in this.
Yeah, which I've never read.
Okay, so this is a very interesting case of adaptation because in many ways it is shot for shot from the comic book. Like certain like panels and dialogue are exactly the same, yet they still manage to miss the point.
But how is it different?
It's different in that the book is very ambiguous. You're left to decide for your own interpretation of who's the hero and who isn't. Well, in this
But
movie,
the
well,
plot's not different, right?
well
The plot?
plot's pretty much the same,
Okay.
just not the same narrative, I'd say. There's a difference between plot and narrative.
Okay.
Because in this movie, it is unequivocal. Rorschach is the hero, and Adrian Veidt is the villain.
Yeah.
There's no debate about it. While in the comic book, they show you all these flawed characters, and you're meant to decide for yourself who's right and who isn't.
So, what is the Silk Spectra? Is she good or bad?
You're meant to decide for yourself. I think she's good. Like, her and Dan are really the moral compass of the whole story.
Yeah, well, I've never read it, so I don't know. I went,
Even for this movie, I think it's true.
okay. Well, there we go.
All right. Thanks, Dad.
All right. I love you.
Love you too.
All right. Bye.
Bye. Right, that was an interesting segment. So, now obviously, that was just a very limited poll, but from a casual comic book fan, he claims the movie works. Now, I don't, but he wouldn't have said that 10 years ago. 10 years ago, he was very weirded out by this movie, as was the general public. They did not accept it, which kind of goes into why I'm glad this movie happened, because it did break ground for what a superhero movie can be, and it did expose people to a lot of different things. So it kind of works there. Overall, I'm glad it happened, but now let's dial it back and just look at this from the point of view of me and the book. Okay? As a Watchmen movie, this kind of sucks. Okay? As you've seen, it's enjoyable on its own. If you just want a cool, dark superhero movie, sure, it works, but this does not get into everything that this book is doing. Okay? There are exceptions to this. Like the book, world building is excellent. New York City looks great. The movie, well, the color palette I think is a bit off, but whatever. By and large, the movie looks fantastic. They spared no expense making this look good. It can compete with Blade Runner or something like that in terms of just dense world building and mythology. It looks very good. And this book certainly respects Watchmen in that it has the exact same panels and dialogue and all that sort of thing, but it does not have the same narrative. This movie comes from a very limited interpretation of this book, which makes sense why in 7th grade I thought this was the coolest shit I'd ever seen, because at that point I also had a very limited interpretation of this book. Okay? Now that I'm an adult and I actually understand what this book is doing and spent 3 episodes talking about it, I can say that this movie just does not have everything that makes this book really important. Some of that is unavoidable because this book was written specifically to show off what the comics medium can do, making a case for comics as a literary medium. This was always going to be a problem with the movie because you can't do that. You can't have these same visual jokes and subplots and stuff like that. It was written specifically for the comic page, and to adapt that to a new medium was always going to be difficult. That being said, one of the worst things you could do is just try to copy and paste it and see if it works, which of course it did not. To be positive, I'm just going to go through everything about the movie I think is good. Opening credit sequence, fan-fucking-tastic. For a second there, they nailed it. They absolutely nailed it. Watching this again, the credits brought tears to my eyes. It was perfect. It was all of these images of 40s through 70s Americana with the influence of these vigilantes, with Bob Dylan playing, and just, it was so dark and poetic and operatic. It was amazing. For 5 minutes there, they had a perfect Watchmen adaptation. The other great scene is Dr. Manhattan's origin, because like the opening sequence, it is a montage of all of these events through history, with the influence of this superhero. And yeah, it's pretty much the most perfect adaptation of Chapter 4 you could have gotten. What really sells it is 2 things. One, Billy Crudup is pretty excellent as Dr. Manhattan. He plays it with a very soft, distant voice, which is appropriate for this character, considering how tormented he's been by his power. And the other thing that really sells it is the score, because they took the Philip Glass score from Koyaanisqatsi Kazi and used it for this scene. That was a great move on their part because, one, Koyaanisqatsi Kazi is an excellent documentary you should all check out, and 2, that documentary basically shows you the world through the point of view of a god, which is absolutely accurate for this character. So yeah, 2 great scenes. Another good thing about this movie, the casting, for the most part. What I do really enjoy about this movie is that they just used character actors. There's no big names, no A-list stars in this whole picture. They just hired reliable, hard-hitting character actors to bring this to life. And I really like that. That makes this feel different from other blockbusters of the day. The 3 best performances I feel are the aforementioned Billy Crudup as Dr. Manhattan, Carla Gugino as Sally Jupiter, who is delightful. She is just a lot of fun, brings a lot of life to this movie, and Patrick Wilson as Night Owl, who I think is fantastic. Wilson's Night Owl does bring a lot of heart to this movie because he does really tap into the naivete of this character. Other good performances, let's say, other entertaining performances are Jeffrey Dean Morgan as the comedian and Jackie Earle Haley as Rorschach. They're both a lot of fun to watch, but that's also a problem because in the comic book, you were not supposed to like these guys. They were supposed to upset you and be a perversion of everything a superhero is supposed to be. But when you see them just be awesome in this movie, it's entertaining, but it really takes away from what this book is trying to say, and what this film is apparently not saying. I brought up The Incredibles earlier because that came out a few years before this, and plot-wise, it did take a lot from Watchmen. And despite being for kids and having a very simple good and evil narrative, that movie still did more to deconstruct superhero values, with the whole no cape scene and the whole if everyone's super, no one will be. Like, there was meaty deconstruction there, even if it did kind of go unnoticed to the kids watching, but you know, sure, it doesn't have the same narrative as Watchmen, but neither does this film really. Oh, another positive, special effects. The effects for Rorschach's mask and Dr. Manhattan's powers are excellent. It really does feel like they're there. That technically, this movie is very impressive for most of it. There's a few points where it's kind of cheesy, but whatever. And you saw my dad say that Silk Spectre and Night Owl are badass. That's a problem on the movie's part if he came away from that with that interpretation, because these guys are not supposed to be badass. That was a fault of them, a fault on this movie's part for putting in so much action scenes, which I get it. They're trying to market it as a blockbuster, and you can't have a blockbuster without action scenes, but if that's the case, why do it at all? I mean, it's Watchmen. The this shouldn't have been like an X-Men movie, which, to be fair, it's not. It's not even close, but still, I would have preferred it if it was more with like the pacing of something like Blade Runner, where the violence is very brief and hard hitting, like the comic book. Both Blade Runner films do that. There's no real action scene in either. To answer my own question regarding how does this compare to its contemporaries like Incredibles, Dark Knight, V for Vendetta, Sin City, stuff like that. Um, Obviously it hasn't aged as well as Incredibles or Dark Knight. No, in fact, it does probably look worse now than it did when it came out. Because when it came out, it was just kind of this breath of fresh air, and people were just glad it happened at all. People weren't critical to it until like a few years later. And like I said, I'm glad it happened because this has maintained a soft spot in comic book history. Like, it has maintained a pretty steady cult following. But if to answer my question, how have subsequent projects influenced this film, especially Batman v Superman, because that is in many ways a remake of this movie. Snyder was very much trying to do this film with Batman and Superman to the point where he put in some Watchmen Easter eggs in the ultimate cut. And yeah, that has kind of cheapened it, because it did show that he didn't really know what he was doing the first time around. And another thing my dad brought up with the idea of making the contemporary, because he thought you could do this modern day, which kind of goes into the problem with this movie. The book, of course, had an excuse. It was written in the 80s. It was written with that fear searing inside the page. So even though the Cold War is long gone, reading it now, it still gives you this intensity that the world's about to end, because even though it was written at that time, it hasn't really been dated, because the energy is still searing through it when you read it. But instead, they made the movie a period piece to try to match up to it, and it doesn't have that energy because they were doing it from a point of view of hindsight. They made it this period piece, and because of that, it doesn't really feel like it's saying anything. Well, one, because the politics were muddled on purpose. The screenwriter has even admitted to that on Twitter. And two, you just can't really talk about the Cold War in 2009 when you see this goofy ass Nixon in Mad Magazine makeup. Like, it just feels silly. Like, doesn't feel like you're saying anything relevant to modern times. Unlike this book, which absolutely had crushing commentary on the then modern times, and because of that, still holds up. Because with the best period pieces, they use the past to talk about now. Like, all of Spielberg's movies do this and stuff like that. Selma was released in 2015 on purpose. You're using the past to talk about now. This movie did that. If they wanted to, they could have gone for the V for Vendetta route, where they took this story about 80s England and instead made it about 9/11. Alan Moore had problems with that, but adaptation-wise, I think it kind of worked because it did make this story relevant for a contemporary audience, you know? This movie doesn't do that. Instead, it's just this period piece that's a period piece for the sake of it, you know? We'll put a pin on that. We'll put a pin on this topic, so we'll go back to it at the end. Speaking of not understanding the source, the humor, this is a very dry, very humorless movie. And don't call me an idiot for saying that, because the comic book, while serious and dark, was also very funny at points. It knew how to play with audience expectations and make them laugh. While this movie doesn't really have any jokes, and when it does take certain gags from the comic and apply them to this movie, it doesn't feel like they get it. It doesn't feel like they're it doesn't feel like they're delivering it as if it's a joke. So it kind of makes it feel kind of embarrassing, you know? Like the whole big figure scene with Mickey from Seinfeld, that's big figure, which yeah, seeing him in this is pretty funny, but when Rorschach is doing the thing where he's fucking with the prisoners by using puns, like this doesn't feel right, you know? Speaking of Rorschach, Jackie O'Haley is good in this. Like his physical presence is great. I'm not sure about the voice though, because I and most people imagine Rorschach as this very monotone, like depressed figure, while Haley just made him like angry all the time, a la Christian Bale Batman, which could have been a jab at that on purpose to try to make a statement about the then modern state of superhero films. But if that was the intent, they should have made it. They should have dug more into that, because this movie should have been commenting on superhero movies the way the book comments on superhero comics. Because this movie does not get that it's a satire. The comic book, it has the same plot, but the comic was a satire. There was irony and deconstruction into all of this. The movie doesn't get that. They just think that the movie just kind of thinks they're superheroes, you know? It doesn't understand that the book was trying to paint them as, you know, egotistical, racist, sexist, just delusional, psychopathic, you know, just sexually frustrated. All of this stuff that barely goes into the movie, if at all. Talk about Eddie Blake. Jeffrey D. Morgan is having a lot of fun in this. He is a blast to watch almost every time he's on screen. But again, that's a problem. He's supposed to be the biggest piece of shit in the whole comic. Seeing him just be this really likable presence in this movie kind of takes away from that. And I know that Snyder prefers these two characters because he gives them some of the most fun stuff in the whole movie. Yet Adrian Veidt, his scenes are the most boring of this whole movie. Nothing's happening. He's just standing there and talking, trying to mumble his way through this every time there's a fight-oriented scene. And by the way, Matthew Good sucks in this movie. He is hands down the worst actor in the whole thing, which I don't want to be too hard on him because it could just be bad direction. I can imagine that because Snyder's not really interested in this character, that he's just kind of fumbling his way through it, not really understanding what's going on. But still, bad decision on the casting part. Jude Law would have been fantastic. I know he said he was interested, and by God, they should have hired him. That would have been awesome. To talk about the most infamous casting decision of this movie, Malin Ackerman. I didn't think she was that bad. I think she got way too much flack for this movie. I mean, it's not a great performance, but I did feel like she was doing her best with this, given the circumstances and probably with the direction she was given. She looks great, for the record. I think she's, like, from a physical standpoint, she's a great Silk Spectre. But yeah, I do think that she probably should have been given more emphasis. She could have had a better chance to shine. What I was really missing was the cynicism from that character, because she is a very like crabby character in the comic, and especially the show. They bring back with Jean Smart's interpretation. She's great. She's a great Laurie. Another main problem that was inevitable was that it's too long and also too short. because they were adapting this 415-page book into a movie. So it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't, because either the fans are going to be upset that you compressed all this stuff into one 3-hour sit. It's going to feel way too short for them, especially in the back half. I feel after chapter 4, it's kind of like watching it in slow and fast forward. They spend like an hour on the first 4 chapters, and then after that, it's just zam. And for the casual audience, it's probably just a bummer that they have to sit through this 3-hour movie. It's not really palatable on either end. Even Terry Gilliam said it should have always been a television miniseries, which we'll get to that. Music cues. I mentioned before how brilliant Times Are Changin' and the Koyaanis Kazi score are as needle drops, but a lot of the other needle drops in this are kind of lame. The worst being Ride of the Valkyries in the Vietnam scene. Like, it feels like it should be a spoof, but it really doesn't. Because it has just such an overplayed needle drop ever since Apocalypse Now. Even in Apocalypse Now, it was kind of a joke. And Sound of Silence in the funeral scene, again, it's way too cliche. It's like almost like something out of Suicide Squad. Some of the ones I'm iffy about are I'm Your Boogeyman during the riot scene and Hallelujah during the sex scene. Those are weird choices, but I somehow don't hate them like the other ones. I don't know. There's something kind of inspired about those decisions, even if it's a little misguided. The main controversy regarding this movie is that they changed the ending. The one thing they changed plot-wise was the ending. They tweaked it a little bit to where instead of the squid, they frames Dr. Manhattan. But from a narrative standpoint, I get it. You only have so much time to tell your story. That was a way to tighten it up that I feel is okay, but oh my god. 11-2 in this movie does not have the crushing power it does in the comic book, because it's fucking scary. It is the weirdest, goriest thing you have ever seen in a comic book page. It is, honest to God, terrifying. While in this movie, you're just kind of seeing all these buildings get disintegrated, something you've seen 1,000 times in blockbusters and comic book films. Like, this kind of makes you think, like, so? This is your you think this is gonna save the world, or at least change the world? It feels way too domestic, both for the characters, since Dr. Manhattan has been a presence in their lives for decades, and for the audience, because we've seen stuff like this before, And also, they never bring up the 9/11 parable, because 2009, 9/11 has already happened. We know how an attack on New York City went down. So it's just kind of like this elephant in the room that 9/11 has never even like made like an allusion to or whatever. Again, something that the TV show does go into. And it's also an elephant in a room, and you're going to be thinking about it because in the movie you've seen the Twin Towers. I mean, it's a period piece in New York City, so of course you're going to have the Twin Towers, but still, it's going to, again, when you see the Twin Towers now, especially in 2009, all you can think about is 9/11. So it's just really odd they tiptoed the way around that. Again, they should have done something with modern politics, and this movie just really doesn't do anything with the political stitch of the time. There's one possible jab at Bush at the end, because they changed the joke from being Robert Redford, who wants a cowboy actor in the White House, to Ronald Reagan, who wants a cowboy in the White House. That could be a jab at Bush, but it's still not really obvious. It doesn't really work as a joke the way the Redford thing does. I also don't like how the climax, again, there's too much fighting. The fight scenes in the climax, again, especially in the climax, go on way too long, and they don't serve any real narrative purpose, except for it's the climax. We have to have the superheroes fighting each other. And they make it such a blatant point that Adrian was wrong. Like, why do that? The whole point is that you're supposed to think for yourself. It's just a bummer that it literally ends with the Dan and Lori looking at him angrily and saying, "You've tarnished your legacy." Like, I don't need this force fed to me, y'all. This isn't Watchmen for babies. And it's just so weird they downplayed the whole ending while upplaying every other gory aspect of the film. You know, it's like gore is okay. Gore is great. It's a great tool to use for storytelling, but come on, you gotta have some purpose behind it. I will say though, Archie is great. I love Archie as a design, and seeing him fly around New York City is pretty awesome. The sex scene is pretty contentious for some, but I don't hate it. I mean, it's a sex scene, and sex scenes in movies, especially R-rated, not NC-17 movies, are pretty uniformly awful. But I don't know. I think they try. I think they did the best they could. What I can't, however, defend is the rape scene, because that was a problem in the comic book, and it's a problem for this movie for not cutting it. They should have taken that judgment call, and they didn't. There's other weird things that give the characters too much credit. Like, in fact, they're literally called the Watchmen throughout this whole movie, which is too badass. While in the comic book, they're the Crime Busters, which is fucking lame. They even changed the costumes to be more badass, you know? Like, this movie gives the characters too much credit when the whole point of the comic was to make you not like them, you know? I'll also say the sound mixing in this movie is really bad. Whoever did the sound mixing for this really dropped the ball, because the dialogue is often way too soft, yet the action and like punches and stuff are way too loud. Like, it's kind of appropriate considering what the focus for this movie was, but damn, they really needed another sound mixer. I said this before, but again, it feels like fast forward through the back 2/3 of the whole comic book. Rorschach's origin, especially, it feels really underdeveloped, which is unavoidable considering how much time they spent on the psychologist. But again, like we said, that was the whole meat of the chapter. That's why it was interesting. When you take that away, it's just this edgelord origin story for this guy, you know. And the fact that they made Rorschach he didn't burn the house down and instead just waxed the guy with a meat cleaver a bunch of times. Like, sure, it's more violent, but it's not as, visceral or impressive, you know? Another thing we have to bring up is the cuts. Because my dad watched this on HBO Max, which is the theatrical cut. I watched the director's cut for watching this. And I have also seen right here I have the ultimate cut I got for Christmas when I was in junior high. Thought it was awesome, but don't have quite the same opinion now. Now, the difference between the main cuts is that if even the director's cut feels too fast at 3 hours, the theatrical must be even worse, because that is only like 2 hours, 40 something minutes, which is long for a blockbuster, but not long for the story. Like, the theatrical cut doesn't even have Hollis Mason's death, which in the director's cut is one of the better scenes in the movie. I actually did enjoy how they intercut it with old school like sepia footage of when he was 901. You know, that was cool. I enjoyed that scene quite a bit. Yeah, it's not even in the theatrical, and to the point the director's cut is the preferred version, to the point where they even put the theatrical on Blu-ray. You can only buy the director's or ultimate. And to get into the ultimate, it's cool that they tried this, but it inevitably didn't work, because, as you know if you read the comic book, that there's subplots regarding the Black Freighter comic strip and the newsstand. The ultimate cut tries to add that stuff in to the main narrative. And it's cool that they tried it, but they again missed the point of why it was there, because the scenes were not interesting but really by themselves. The reason why they were interesting in the comic at all is because of how they juxtapose with each other and with the main narrative. It was to show how many things you can overlap to really increase the feeling of Cold War tension. That's why it worked. While in this movie, you just get some irrelevant, like, you just get this irrelevant pirate cartoon. I mean, sure, it's cool, the animation is nice, but it doesn't really feel like it has a purpose with this main narrative, either if you watch it by itself or interwoven with the main movie. And the Ultimate Cut has certain like Bernie scenes, like exclusive to this version. Certain scenes of the two Bernies at the newsstand, and it's cute. The guys they got look exactly like the Bernies in the comics, but damn, does it completely wreck the pacing? Snyder himself admitted they had to Jimmy rig it. And so, that's especially a problem because at the end, when Bike triggers 11-2, it doesn't have the same impact because you have to sit through yet another Bernie scene. While in the comic book, you can more easily like flip flop between these two things. It doesn't really give it the same emotional power that it did in the comic. So if I were to recommend this movie, which I kind of do, I'm not 100% positive, but I like it more than I don't, even if it is kind of a guilty pleasure, because I do like how they exposed millions of people to this story and to what a comic book movie can be. We likely would not be here without this movie doing the groundwork. But at the same time, that's a problem because for about 10 years, nobody could separate Watchmen from this movie. It did dwarf the comic book to the point where even if you tried reading the comic book, all you could really think about was the movie. A guy on a YouTube comment said it's like Zack Snyder put an ink blot on every page. And yeah, I do get that because this was such a sacred, untouchable text. When one guy finally did give his interpretation, of course it dwarfed all the others. There was no variety to it. Thankfully, it's not the case now. To mention again how muddled the politics were, that really comes true with especially the stuff with Rorschach, because he's not nearly as bigoted as he was in the comic book in this movie. Same thing with the New Frontiersman. They mention it being like this super right wing publication, but they don't go into exactly how far that goes. In the comic book, you read the excerpts and you see they're basically Nazis. Like, it's genuinely disgusting, and you see how that influences the world. But in this movie, there's kind of another magazine. There's kind of another newspaper. It's like, okay. So when Rorschach's journal is going to be, when you see at the end when Rorschach's journal is going to be published by them, you're just kind of, all right, cool. You're not really fearing for the world, the future, because to them it just kind of seems like another newspaper. You don't realize the kind of freaks that read this thing. What they should have done is again tap into the current climate at the time with the rise of Fox News and Rush Limbaugh. And how popular conservative media was during the 2000s. They could have done something with that, because the guy who plays Godfrey does look like Roger Ailes. I don't know. They could have done something with it, but they didn't. And one more thing I want to say about politics. We talked a lot in the other episodes how the comic book is an exposure and deconstruction of the Randian and libertarian like worldviews of Silver Age comics. While this movie was directed by a known and proud Randist, to the point where one of his planned projects coming up is the Fountainhead. I don't want to bash on the guy too much because he has gotten a lot of shit in the past few years, and I do kind of respect him as a filmmaker. I'm just saying that was a very odd decision to let him direct this movie. If he's a Randist and he's tackling on this very anti-Randian book, even if you agree with Rand, you should say that's a very odd decision. They probably just didn't even notice. So yeah, in general, my thoughts are, it's okay. As a superhero film, it's influential, and if you take it on its own, there's certainly a lot to enjoy. It has great scenes, great characters, some great performances. It looks awesome, but you do realize that this is all surface level when you compare it to the book, because it does miss the forest for the trees. It has the notes, but not the melody. And yeah, I'll kind of leave it at that. I will say, though, in the playlist, one, you should watch the Alan Moore interview where he talks about adaptations. That's what inspired me to do this show. It's a great video. And two, you should watch the old Spill stream where they talk about the Sex Man's review of this movie. Watch that because it's hilarious. And also, the Desolation Row MCR song was made for this movie. Pretty badass cover. I don't really think it fits with Dylan, but whatever on its own. It's a cool song. I love MCR. Also, the trailer for this movie is pretty awesome. Like, my first exposure to Watchmen was seeing the trailer for this movie in front of the Dark Knight with that Smashing Pumpkins song, and yeah, it's a pretty epic trailer. Look it up. I'll also say that Smashing Pumpkins song is an alternate version of a song they use for Batman and Robin. So there is this link between the Watchmen film and Batman and Robin. Think about that. So before I wrap this up, there's two more tie-in materials I want to get into. When the movie was in theaters, they released this DVD that included the Black Freighter short that I talked about earlier, and also another short called Under the Hood. It was like this 40-minute mockumentary about Hollis Mason and the Minutemen, and it's pretty solid. I probably enjoyed it when I watched all three of these things a few nights ago. I probably enjoyed Under the Hood the most. That was cute. That was fun. I mean, one problem is that it's rated PG, so yeah, a Watchmen property is rated PG. So if your kid wants to see it, you can kind of show them this, but I doubt they'll be interested. So, well, yeah, I don't like how they kind of avoid a lot of the darkness regarding these characters. It's not completely sugar-coated. Like, they go into the HUAC hearings and stuff like that. Like, there is political stuff going on in this documentary, and just as a pastiche, it is really cute to see all these old timers, like, to talk about the glory days with the costumes. They really did, like, the world building is kind of as rich as the movie. They really did, like, put some craft into what is essentially a bonus feature, and props to them. That was cool to see. This is the only, I would say, much more into Black Freighter. This is the proper companion to the film. This is the only one of the tie-in materials that really enriches this film. And the other tie-in material I experienced for this episode was the video game Watchmen: The End Is Nigh. I spent $10 to play it on Steam, and oh boy, was that an experience, because this game is basically the embodiment of everything wrong with the Watchmen movie. Because they want you to play this game. Maybe this was just for marketing, but the PS3 version came with the movie, and it was called Watchmen: The Complete Experience. So they absolutely intended this to be like a tie-in to the film, like a companion to the film. And if that's the case, it makes the movie look a lot worse, because this game is a beat 'em up. That's it. All you do is play as Rorschach and Night Owl and beat the fuck out of criminals. There is more fighting in one level of this game than the entirety of the comic book. Not even that, like, more fighting in 5 minutes of this game than the entirety of the book. If you know anything about Watchmen, you know it's a bad idea. It's just a celebration of everything the comic book was critiquing. Watchmen, like, I'm not against a Watchmen video game, because if they did something like a Telltale adventure series like they did for Wolf Among Us, where, like, because Fables was also not a comic book you'd accept to work for video games, but it did. That's a really cool game. So if instead they made it like this point and click, like, adventure game where you just kind of spend time in this world with these characters and figure out a mystery, that could work. That could be an actually good Watchmen game, but instead they made this. In the playlist, I have a video where they talked about the canceled Watchmen game that could have come out instead of this had it not been canceled. And I don't know if it would have been good, but it would have been better than this. It would have at least been more interesting than this. So it's a very brief game. It's only like 6 levels, and you play as either Rorschach or Night Owl. Between the two, Rorschach's more fun just because he's more violent. Of course he is. And they tried to have an interesting story regarding the assassination of Woodward and Bernstein. Like, that's a fine premise for a Watchmen game, but it doesn't really go anywhere. The controls are okay. Just fighting in general, it's an alright game. Like, if you take it just as a beat 'em up, it's like a 5 out of 10. It's fine, but of course, it's a Watchmen game. It's like a 0. But I do like how the cutscenes are all animated like the motion comic. And they did bring back Jackie Earle Haley and Patrick Wilson to reprise these characters. Even if they're delivering really shitty dialogue, it does feel like it's them. That was pretty cool. They actually went the extra mile for that. It wasn't they didn't intend this to be a shitty tie-in game, even though it is. And if you're going to have violence in this game, have it be like BioShock. Because sure, BioShock is a first-person shooter, but still has you think about your decisions, you know? This game never does that. So that's The End is Nigh. But it doesn't end there, because a few months later, they released The End is Nigh Part 2, which is half as long and so much fucking worse. If The End is Nigh is like a 5 out of 10 game on its own, this is like a 1, even if you take it on its own. Because it's half as long and so much shittier. There's no real story. Like, there's a setup for a story, but halfway through you find out that was a bunch of bullshit. So all you do is spend the entire game beating the fuck out of prostitutes and guys at a strip club. That's it. It's just here for slut shaming. It is so fucking stupid. I felt actively dirty playing this. It would be one thing if it was like critiquing Rorschach's view on prostitution, but it doesn't. It reinforces it. Jesus Christ, even Grand Theft Auto is a better representation of sex and just women in general than this fucking game. Jesus Christ. I couldn't even finish it. I got to the last like 10 minutes. I just had to stop. Like, it was actively disgraceful. Out of everything that I'm experiencing for this podcast, End is Night Part 2 has to be the worst thing out of anything for this podcast. I'd rather play the first game again or reread the entire role-playing game than play this shit again, or even just watch a YouTube video of it. It's that bad. Has to be the bottom of the barrel for this whole experience. It sucks. Don't play it. So yeah, okay movie. Not very good adaptation, but it's enjoyable on its own. I just wish that there was an adaptation that, say, took place in modern day, was a television series, so it gives this world and these characters more time to breathe. Change the story up to include new characters as well as give old ones a new twist. Cleverly echo the original story while never outright emulating it, and have it be applicable for current themes and the current political climate, and just be absolutely outstanding both on its own and as a continuation and enrichment of the source, which, oh boy, I think my wish came true. Ooh. So yeah, that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And next week, we'll be covering what's on the wall, the Before Watchmen prequel comics. Bye.